Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the third and final session of the Soloclim Symposium. My name is Emma Greer. I'm a partner at Carlo, Ratti, Associati, where I direct our in-house think tank, Think. And I'm going to be moderating this session. For the next 90 minutes, we're going to be talking about climate responsive systems for outdoor climate adaptation. We're joined by 7 wonderful panelists whom I'd like to introduce formally. Sitting next to me, the Soloclim Research Fellows, Sinead Nicholson and Marika Tomasi. From the world of research, we've got Matt Santamorris, a professor of high performance architecture at the University of New South Wales in Australia. Welcome back, Professor Santamorris.
Thank you.
And Cohen Steemers, professor of sustainable design at the University of Cambridge. Hello, Professor Steemers. Welcome. Bridging the gap between research and professional practice, we have Thomas Auer, partner and managing director of climate engineering firm Transolar and professor of building technology and climate responsive design at TU Munich. Hi, Thomas. And Belinda Tato, founding partner of design firm Ecosistema Urbano and associate professor of landscape architecture at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. Last but not least, we have Piero Perizzaro, the City of Milan's Chief Resilience Officer. Hello, Piero.
I'm sorry, as we had to say in a few times, Mr. Piero Perizzaro will not be able to participate and to attend this meeting, but I'm substituting him. My name is Marina Trentin, and I directly work with him on environmental adaptation, sustainability, and on climate change adaptation measures.
Thanks for joining us, Marina. Welcome. In other words, we've tried to bring to the table a range of voices, both from research, emerging voices, and more experienced researchers. We've got private practice as well as public administration. The idea is to have a more informal conversation. I'll direct questions to each of you, but please jump in physically or virtually if you feel you'd like to contribute your points. But as a first exercise, a sort of icebreaker, I'd like to have each speaker respond to today's topic with a short introduction in 5 minutes or less. Who are you? What are you working on? And what is for you a climate responsive system? At CRA, for example, we often strive to create spaces that sense and respond, a sort of living architecture that responds to the user in real time. So if you can tell us about the climate responsive systems that you work on or that you study, what the temporal scales that they work on, scale or scales, and what kind of inputs or variables do they consider? So maybe I think we start in reverse order. So Marina from Piero Perizzaro's team, if you could start. Sorry to put the pressure on you. Take it away.
Don't worry. Of course, since this is what I'm working on. So as a public administration and as a municipality, of course, we need to take care, first of all, about which is the impact on citizens and on what we call common spaces. So a sort of right to access to the same kind of services and the same kind of quality of life. So starting from that, what we work on, for example, are instruments like plans or programs or projects who help us in creating equality about accessing climate adaptation and climate resilient areas or places to be or places to stay or services. And then we also try to make clear that our city must be resilient and must be and must adapt to the changes that are happening in climate. So first of all, we need to know what's happening, and we had to work on what we call the local climate profile. So we wanted to describe what we have, what is happening, and we asked the support of, for example, ARPA Emilia-Romagna, who is the environmental service for the Emilia-Romagna region, who is skilled in making observations and making previsions and scenarios. And we asked them to teach us and to teach our our regional in Lombardy environmental service how to do that. So first of all, you have to know, let me say, you have to know your enemy, you have to know your scenario, the scenario in which you have to move and in which you have to make provisions and plans. So after that, we used a lot of projects and plans and programs, and we tried to integrate them into what we called air and climate plan. So we it's piano aria e clima in Italian. So we try to put and integrate all together the plans and projects which can act on adaptation and act on the quality of environment in adaptation to climate change. It's not so easy, as you can understand, since a city like Milan is very, very complicated in that. We understood that we have problems with heat waves and heat island effects, of course, and then we understood that we have problems with the management of water. So we have problems with floods from two of our main rivers, the Lambro and the Seveso, and we have to prevent any kind of flood and to understand how they can be better understood and prevented when, just because we need to save people and goods in their valley. And then we have problems with the runoff when a lot of rains are precipitating in a very short time. And we knew from our scenarios that these kind of events are increasing in the next 10 and then more projection about years in the next 10 years. So what we have to face in trying to integrate these different kind of policies, different kind of measures, was trying to get more than trying to tackle a multiple problem, so a multiple bunch of problems, just with the less actions we could. For example, we want to work on runoff and on equality about people accessing climate adaptation. And we want to work about runoff management, for example, using what we call the depavimentation. So creating a more permeable soil inside the city. And this is just an example, but I just don't want to put too much on the ground, since this is a very practical and very positive kind of action and kind of description.
Thank you, Marina. That's a great example. And we'll come back to you soon to ask you more about what Milan is doing to become more resilient. Belinda, over to you for a quick introduction to yourself and your work.
Yeah, hello, everybody. Thank you for the invitation to join this panel. My name is Belinda Tato, and I work at Ecosistema Urbano, which stands for Urban Ecosystem. So I've been working for the last 20 years trying to make public space more accessible, more comfortable, also in terms of climatic comfort. And I would like to make just a few points. The first one is that climate comfort is kind of part of trying to provide this kind of public space as an infrastructure, as a basic infrastructure for healthier life. And we've been working in different parts of the world, trying to, again, work with both passive systems and active systems, trying to keep low-tech solutions so that we can actually guarantee long-term maintenance, because one of the challenges about introducing any kind of system is the long-term maintenance. I would also like to point out that actually climatic comfort is towards equity, because it is usually the most vulnerable communities that are the ones that are more exposed to heat in many different parts of the world. So because they, maybe their domestic space is less equipped, maybe they spend more time in the public space. So, it's not only kind of when we're working from I don't know, from the privilege of the first world, we really are kind of assuming, making a number of assumptions, but actually there is a number of places around the world that lack this accessibility to healthy, climatically comfortable public spaces. So these are also something interesting. I would also like to point that it is important to work at different scales. It was one of the questions that you were addressing. So there are solutions for both the building, the neighborhood scale, and the planning. And so it's a kind of a matter of cooperation between the different stakeholders, different people engaged into the different parts, because there is, again, there are passive solutions and active solutions that we can address. Of course, there is a number of the previous speaker was mentioning. We are working with, again, low-tech materials, but also materials, how can we increase the permeability? How can we lower down the temperatures, again, at different scales? And the other point that I would like to say is that we cannot do this without some sort of participation, because in many cases, again, it's not only about providing the space, it's also about the maintenance, and that implies the correct use or the most efficient use by the user. So I think there is an educational component about this, and we cannot do this only from the technical part of view, but actually we have to make a kind of a broader conversation with a larger audience, which is the users. And I think that's about it to start.
Thank you, Belinda. And we'll definitely come back to what citizens can do, because I know that's a topic that came up. What we can do in our own cities to help adapt to climate change. Thomas, take it away.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think a lot had been said already. Not sure if I need to introduce myself. I think it's the same people joining who joined yesterday already. So, and Emma, you already introduced me.
I know you.
So let me focus on this question of, let's say, climate responsiveness and comfort, climate adaptation. We know that this climate adaptation has lots of aspects. Some of them have been mentioned already, like heavy rainfalls, etc. But let me talk only about climate adaptation. We know that our cities need to become more resilient. We know that we need to have a master plan. I think that's what we talked yesterday already for climate adaptation strategies. What I always find very interesting, I mentioned it yesterday with our climate walks, we found that these old medieval city structures are actually very resilient. They work really well. And we did studies in Andalusia in southern Spain. And I think if we need to understand potential transformational strategies, we should go there and really study what works really well in these kind of extreme conditions. What we always have been impressed is by these shading structures, these flexible shading structures, and how easy they got implemented in Andalusia. And we know that we can't do this. And Emma, you asked for an example. And an example I find really impressive is a project we did not work on, which is a flexible shading structure designed by Kugler architects with structure engineers from Germany. It's in books in Switzerland, and it's a whole street, pretty similar to the situation you see in many cities in Andalusia. But it's a flexible shading structure, and it can open and close within 5 minutes. But then with the cold climate conditions, the heavy winds, the snow, etc., we can have in Central Europe. It's much heavier, obviously, than what we are used to see in Andalusia. But this is something I find really interesting, because if we look at shading structure at nighttime, if we take it away, we get the radiation to space. So we need this kind of adaptation over the course of the year, over the course of the day, towards different climate events. However, I think what I find interesting looking at this project, that it covers a whole street, that it's basically based on traditional strategies, but then translated with contemporary technologies into a different climate, adapted to a different context. And I think this is very interesting. And I think we can learn a lot from these, let's say, vernacular design approaches. Thanks.
Thanks, Thomas. And we'll also come back to the differences or the design strategies for working in existing or medieval city contexts versus a more tabula rasa or new city build approach? Because I know that your team has worked in both contexts. But first, I'll hand it over to Professor Steemers for a quick introduction to himself and his work.
Oh, thank you very much. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, thanks, Emma. I think both Thomas and Belinda pointed at some of the issues that I was going to raise too, with respect to your statement at the beginning about creating spaces that sense and respond. I think as a word of caution, and I think Belinda has mentioned the focus on people, which is one of the areas of focus. People are climate responsive. People sense and respond to their environment. So it's important not to take away their agency with technological systems, right? Think of people as responding to climates instead of climate responsive systems, which might imply, these systems might imply that there is some kind of ideal or optimal set of conditions, and might imply that people are inactive. And we know, paradoxically, that the presence of discomfort engenders a strong sense of comfort. So what we really need to think about is offering agency to people to choose climates within an urban environment. And then we can think about urban climate diversity, perhaps in the way we think of biodiversity. And we could use metrics and systems and techniques from that field of biodiversity to define species of urban climates to assess diversity, or to assess missing or struggling species of climate conditions. And opportunities for new species of urban climates, where perhaps technology can and will play a very significant role. So on the positive side, we can definitely refer to technology and systems to increase we should be using technology and systems to increase human agency and choices, i.e. creating more species, to make people explore and discover, to challenge us rather than to make us lazy and static, which technology sometimes leads us to. We can also think of responsive technology as a way of avoiding extreme conditions. And we've talked a little bit, Belinda mentioned very extreme conditions, where it's really important to ensure that there is sufficient shade and breeze in very hot and sunny environments, or to provide wind and rain shelter in cold and wet climates. So there's definitely a role for systems, but I think we should be careful not to use systems to design out what it is we enjoy about urban environments. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Steemers. And in a moment, I'll come back to yourself and also Marika and Sinead, who've been working closely with our design team on a few projects where we often start from the perspective of the user and think about how our design can actually enhance their agency and make them active agents in the city space. So we'll come back to that theme definitely in a moment. Professor Santamores, are you with us from Australia? We've spoken with you already yesterday, so most of us in the room know you, but if you don't mind giving us a quick introduction and tell us a little bit about the work you're doing in this space, that would be great.
Sure, thank you very much. Since 2016, I'm in Sydney, in Australia, and I'm the director of the High Performance Architecture in the University of New South Wales. Together with my colleagues, we work on mitigation technologies, and we have three main axes of research. The first one has to do with the development of new mitigation technologies, and mainly advanced materials. I have presented yesterday the work we are doing. The second one has to do with the impact of the different, let's say, problems of overheating around the world on health, energy, survivability, economy, and also pollution and environmental quality in different parts of the city. And the third, the more important, we're carrying out real scale projects on mitigation all around the world. Actually, we have big projects in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia, in Calcutta, in Dubai, in Kuala Lumpur, in Houston, and also in Darwin, in Australia, Sydney, Melbourne, and in the desert of, let's say, of Australia. So through this project, we learn a lot. I like really to present, yesterday I presented the work we're doing on let's say, on materials. I like to present some, let's say, in 2 minutes, the work we are doing on greenery, 3 slides, and what we found through the real project, not just, theoretical research, in all around, the world through the projects we are carrying out. First, what is the real mitigation potential of, let's say, green infrastructure in cities? We have, let's say, collected data from about 50 different cities all around the world, where the impact, the mitigation impact or the cooling potential of increased green infrastructure in cities has been evaluated. And you can see, for example, in the specific slide, what really are the results. You can see that the greenery is contributing more to cooling during the night period, and this is very well known. During the day period, even if you increase green infrastructure to 80%, 70%, the maximum decrease of the temperature you may expect at the city level is 1 degree. But during the night, we may have, let's say, a decrease of the temperature, which may be as high as 2 or maybe higher. Second point that I like to stress, and sometimes it's very much forgotten, is that greenery is not providing cooling and respiration, at all or during all climatic conditions. It is well known that there's a threshold temperature above which trees stop to provide evapotranspiration and cooling. And this threshold temperature depends, of course, on the type of let's say, of trees. For example, for eucalyptus in Australia, you see the graph, above 36 degrees, trees and eucalyptus, they stop to provide cooling and evapotranspiration. And in this case, they increase the temperature of the cities because the temperature, of the leaves is much higher than the ambient temperature. And this happens because, they stop circulating their sap in order to be protected. This affects very much the temperature, of our cities. And it is well known that during the last period, the last years, temperature during heat waves inside urban park is higher than the temperature outside the urban parks. Third, if this is well understood, then we can understand why in many cities where they have, let's say, planted a very high number of trees, non-irrigating trees, temperature has increased. This is the case, for example, of Los Angeles, very well documented. This is the case of Riyadh. You can see, for example, that in Riyadh, this is the distribution of the temperature. Once we increase greenery up to 30%, non-irrigated trees, temperature during the day may increase up to 1.5 degrees. On the contrary, once we have irrigated trees, the temperature during the day may decrease up to 1 degree. So let's say evapotranspiration and cooling by greenery is very much associated with irrigation. Not irrigated trees means heating, not cooling. The impact. Trees may contribute a lot in greenery to decrease the energy consumption of buildings. From our, let's say, research in Riyadh, we have seen that even non-irrigated trees, because of the very low temperature during the night period in Riyadh, not in Europe, may decrease the cooling demand of buildings up to 30–35%. And this is a result of, let's say, of data collected from about 4,000 buildings downtown, let's say, the city of Riyadh. And the most important thing, that we have to consider about, let's say, the use of greenery in cities is also the additional pollution that may be created. It is well known that most of the greenery may emit BVOCs, which are 4 times more toxic than the exhaust of the cars. So if we don't take care of the type of greenery and how this has to be, let's say, implemented, we may have an increase, of pollution, and this is very common in many cities. You see, for example, the results for NOx and ozone for the city of, let's say, of Riyadh. The last thing that I like to point out is the tremendous impact of greenery on, let's say, heat-related mortality. Through, let's say, more than 60 studies all around the world, it is very well documented that the increase of the green infrastructure in cities, let's say, may decrease the temperature of cities during the day up to 1 degree, and this corresponds to a decrease of heat-related mortality by 8%. So if we succeeded to have let's say, an optimized implementation of greenery or green infrastructure in trees, we may have a tremendous impact on heat-related mortality. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Santamoris. If you're not studying Milan already, I would love to see this comparison of the limits of greenery on reducing overheating in cities. Milan, as you may know, this winter kicked off a citywide initiative called Forestami to plant trees throughout the city. Perhaps Marina can tell us a little bit more about that initiative later on, but I would be curious to see how that impacts the temperature in Milan over the next couple of decades. But first, I'll leave the stage to our Soloclim research fellows, to Sinead and to Marika, to introduce themselves briefly and their work.
I'm Sinead. I'm working on climate responsive systems at the small kind of local scale. And I'm really interested, one, in actually how to look at the design process and combine the kind of microclimate research I'm looking at into design. And I'm also very interested in thermal comfort, in how it also addresses the user side and how we can really consider the varying experiences of people. I mean, every person has a different experience of thermal comfort. So how do we consider that in design? My background is in environmental design, and
Thank you, Sinead. Marika.
Good afternoon. My name is Marika. I have a background in building engineering and architecture, but now I'm working on climate responsive systems at the urban scale. The focus of my research at this current stage is on solar radiation and how we can benefit from how solar radiation interacts with urban morphology. In particular, my focus and let's say the main aim of this current stage is to push for a bottom-up approach combined to a top-down one of the planning practice. So I'm trying to insert the user perspective at the urban scale, and I'm trying to combine, for instance, solar radiation with the user path, with the walking speed, to understand how climate actually affects not only the users, but also how the user experience the space and how they move in outdoor spaces, what are the hotspots, the most attractive points, and how we can create flexible outdoor spaces for creating comfortable and healthy cities.
Super. Well, thanks everyone for this round of introduction. I'll now go into some questions which I will direct to specific speakers, but please wave a hand or raise a digital hand or just jump right in if you want to address the point and it hasn't been directed to you specifically. So this first question I wanted to pose to Professor Santamores and Professor Auer, and it stems from a conversation that I had with Sinead and Marika when we were thinking about how to structure this session. And I immediately jumped, when we talk about climate adaptation in the built environment, I immediately jumped to indoor spaces, saying, well, aren't we talking about energy efficient buildings, better envelopes, better insulation, improved ventilation, all of these essential actions which have been singled out by the European Green Deal and the renovation wave. But Sinead and Marika quickly brought me back to the top. We said, no, we're talking about outdoor space. And I said, okay, well, that's interesting. What is it about outdoor spaces? Why is it important? What is the role of outdoor and public spaces in the fight against climate change? And how has the COVID pandemic actually changed the way we approach the design of outdoor and public spaces? Perhaps we'll start with you, Professor Santamores. The role of, why are we talking about outdoor spaces?
Yeah. We're talking about outdoors because, regional climatic change is the most documented phenomenon of climatic change. We have evidence and we know about regional climatic change and heat islands since the beginning of the 20th century, when we understood that in London, temperature was higher by 2 or 3 degrees. So let's say regional climatic change is very important. The average, intensity or magnitude of the urban heat island is 4 or 5 degrees, sometimes more. And the real problem, of let's say for regional climatic change is not in Europe. It's not really in the European cities. Although in Europe we have a problem of urban heat island. It is in the third world, in Asia, in Africa, and in the mega cities. And the real game is there. It's not in Europe, it's not really in North America. The real game is there because we have the mega cities and because, the intensity of the urban heat island, because of the way that these cities are built, may be as high, as 10, 12 degrees. This has a tremendous impact, increases the energy consumption for cooling up to 100%, increases heat-related mortality by 40–50%, and it creates huge problems, to the local environment and to the environmental quality, increasing pollution, etc., etc. We have to see the whole problem, in the context of the global development. Actually, we need by 2050 about 3 billion new residences, 3 billion new buildings, all around the world. So the main question is how to build these new buildings in which environment. So this is the main question, in order really to improve, let's say, the environmental quality of our cities and decrease the energy consumption and provide, a more healthy environment for, the new citizens. We expect 2 to 3 billion new people by 2050. We need to employ, advanced technologies. Do we have the technologies? Yes, we have the technologies. We can have zero energy buildings even in 2050, even if we have an increase of the temperature by 2 degrees. This is very well proven. The problem is not technology. The problem is not real technology. We can have, and we can really build houses and buildings with zero energy consumption, even in the tropics. And this is very well known, actually in the tropics, we have zero cooling buildings. Also, we can really decrease the peak temperature of cities up to 3–4 degrees. With the new materials, we expect that by, let's say, the next 5 years, we may decrease the peak temperature of cities up to 5 degrees. It's not enough, but it's important. So the combined impact of adaptation and mitigation may really provide zero energy buildings from the technological point of view. Unfortunately, it's not technology that defines the future. It's policy that defines the future. And policy really do not follow what technology really predicts. I'm not optimistic that the 3 billion new houses, the 3 billion new buildings, the new cities will be built the proper way. And I'm not optimistic because to do that, we need to have a tremendous budget, which is not available in these countries. For example, in order to, let's say, follow the zero carbon scenario of International Energy Agency, we have to invest for, let's say, the decarbonization of the electricity sector about 180 trillions of, let's say, American dollars by 2050. Perhaps this money may exist in United States or in Europe, but do not exist, in the third world. And the tendency actually in the third world is not really to follow such a trend. For example, actually the Chinese, they install everywhere in Africa, let's say some conventional coal stations, huge coal stations that will, let's say, continue to work for the next 30 years. So in reality, the political trends do not follow the technological trends. So this is the major problem. We scientists, we develop technologies, we develop knowledge, we develop, whatever it is important. The problem is that economy, the problem is that the actual policy which is followed do not really follow this path. And I'm not so optimistic. If, anyway, we do not follow the proper path, unfortunately, by 2050, we may have up to 3 billion people living in slums. The energy consumption in these areas may increase tremendously. Pollution will be a huge problem. CO2 and, problems of climatic change will be tremendous. This will create a huge problem of immigration. If Europe and United States, they believe that they can close the borders and the problem will stay in the third world, they make a huge mistake. All these people will move in Europe and they will force to live there. So it is very important that we have a global policy to follow the problems mainly in the third world. And this means really that we need to have a global policy that do not really just look around, our house or around our city, but a more global, let's say, approach that tries really to provide solutions for areas where the problem exists.
Could you say then that outdoor spaces that provide comfortable microclimates could be maybe not an alternative or not a solution to new residences built with the right technology, but could we think of public spaces as a refuge, as a place for vulnerable communities to go in the absence of adequate housing?
Of course, it is important, and of course, you know, it is extremely important, really, to consider, you know, environmental quality of outdoor spaces. But the problem is that because of poverty and because of the lack of resources, they can't do that. They cannot use, for example, the proper materials. They don't have the knowledge which kind of trees they have to plant. They don't have the water, or if when they have the water, they use the water for other sources. They don't have the knowledge how to do it. I'm involved, you know, actually in 2 or 3 projects in Africa, in Mombasa, in Kenya, and another one in Senegal, in real projects, really. And the problems are completely different than the problems we have in Europe. For example, in these areas, the priorities are completely different. They have to live. They have a tremendous problem of poverty. They have a tremendous problem of lack, you know, of proper houses. So environmental quality of the outdoor spaces is something really that they understand, but they don't have the resources and the knowledge to address it. What is very important for them is to build, you know, and the big Chinese companies, they are there and they build whatever, you know, and these buildings will stay there for 40, 50 years, terrible quality, huge energy consumption, if they have energy, you know, very conventional outdoor spaces, non-proper materials, no technological developments. And so, okay, we have the knowledge, we have the technology. They know that it is important really to apply all these technologies. They can't do that because of the lack of resources. So this is the real problem. It's not a scientific problem. It's not a question of priority. It is an issue that has to do really with the political and the economic priorities in the third world. And given that by 2050, about 75% of the global population will live in cities, and about, let's say, 65% of this population will be in, let's say, developing countries, the real problem is there. So if we don't address in a holistic way, the political, economical, environmental, and energy, and of course, let's say, global problem in these areas, there's no hope to make, let's say, some small changes in Milan or in Berlin or in Athens. Okay, it's fine, wonderful. But the problem is not there because the cities do not increase. And these cities will not have, you know, a tide of new population. So the real, let's say, future of the world is in the third world. And the real problem is there. And perhaps this is not very well understood in Europe.
Perhaps that is a subject also for the next Soloclim Symposium that we need to add to the agenda. I'll stop you there, Professor Santamores, and turn it over to Thomas. Of course, if others want to speak to the same themes that Professor Santamores mentioned, please do jump in. But first, if we can hear from Thomas. Thomas, yesterday you mentioned that for the last 30 years you've been working in climate engineering, and for the last 15, outdoor spaces have started to roll in and become of increasing importance. Can you comment on why that is? Why outdoor spaces?
Let's say, first of all, I have to say that I do not share this pessimistic view of Professor Santamores.
Oh, thank God. I'm sweating. I'm very nervous. Thank you.
And all the statistics, for instance, on poverty worldwide does not prove this. Anyway, it would be a long debate. And of course, what I agree upon is that there are places on this planet where climate change is going to be more severe than in Central Europe. I think there is no doubt about this. However, this does not mean that it doesn't matter. This does not mean that we can ignore it. Of course, we have our duties, and our duty is let's say, becoming carbon neutral, is a carbon neutral transformation of our existing building stock. And that's something that's a design task. That it's not an engineering task only. Of course, there's some engineering involved, but it's also a design task. And what we see with COVID, etc., is the importance of the outdoor environment, the relevance of the outdoor environment. I just recently saw a publication how many new office buildings are getting built with, let's say, lots of terraces. so that people can work outdoors. So we start to recognize again how important outdoor environments are for people, and also in the neighborhood, at the building, your private outdoor space, but also in the neighborhood, these neighborhood parks, pocket parks, etc. And so to this regard, I, let's say, heard an interview of this city planner from Munich for 30 years. And she said, we cannot solve all the problems we have in our cities, or we can only solve the problems we have in our cities through the quality of the public realm. That's the key for almost everything. So that's why it is important. And if we don't fix it, if we don't get this climate adaptation strategy solved, and having always, let's say, urban heat island effect in mind, then we end up in our Central European cities having air conditioning everywhere. Of course, we can solve it with money. Of course, we can solve it with energy use, but that's not what we should aim for, that we have heat rejection fans running everywhere and we have noise level like an Asian city in an outdoor environment. Let's say it's the kind of quality we want to live in. That's what we determine today. The kind of quality of our cities in 20, 30 years is what we determine today. In terms of noise levels, in terms of heat contribution into our city, heat dissipation, etc., etc. And in terms of and then talking about facades, I think, Emma, you addressed a very important issue, which is building facades. And I think over the past 20, 30 years, when we thought of facade technology and facade of the future and adaptive facades, et cetera, it was always about metrics that were related to the indoor environment and energy performance. We completely ignored let's say, the impact the facade has on the outdoor environment. And think about you're standing on a hot summer day in front of a glass tower. It becomes unbearable. So we have the way we have designed buildings was in a way that we make the outdoor environment as bad as we can. And this is something, this impact on the outdoor environment, we need to understand. And then there is an interdependency, and that's something I mentioned yesterday. I always think that we have to distinguish between microclimate and outdoor comfort. Microclimate for me in Central European cities is mainly about the nighttime temperatures. If we have this almost 10-degree delta at nighttime to the suburbs, and this is a problem. This is a problem in terms of mortality rate. This is a problem that people don't find relief, that we need air conditioning, etc. In terms of outdoor comfort, I completely agree with what Professor Steamer said. We need to give people choices. We can't air condition our whole cities. We need to have specific spots where people find relief. I always, let's say, very much admired your work, Belinda. This is exactly what we need. Let's say, spots where people can gather, where people can find relief, where let's say, places for people, but not the whole city. We can't air condition the whole city. We have to make sure that our cities do not heat up and store the heat into the nighttime. That's the microclimate issue. And the comfort issue is about specific locations. And then what we still do not understand, and that's an important task for research in thermal comfort, all our thermal comfort research is based about or is related to people being permanently in the same environment, but in the same environmental conditions. But in an outdoor environment, it's constantly changing. And these dynamic effects, we do not fully understand yet. How much, let's say, heat stress, for what period of time can people accept certain heat stress before we need to find relief, before we need to find a cold spot. So that's something we need to better understand and get implemented in city planning in terms of what's the distance people can walk through let's say, a zone of heat stress before there need to be a location, etc. So I think there's a lot to do for research. There's also already a lot of knowledge. Relating it all on vegetation, that's something I also agree to Professor Santamores. I think we create, and Belinda, you also said it about maintenance, water demand. I think that we need to be smarter than just saying trees are going to solve everything.
A lot of room for improvement then. I hope that those are opportunities and we can remain optimistic. But I have to say a lot of what Professor Santamores also resonates with what I'm reading and with what we are seeing around us in terms of climate disasters. In fact, the UN's latest report on climate change really warns that regardless of what we do in the short term, for the next 30 years, we are going to be facing more heat waves, more extreme downpours, more intense droughts. And I think much like the COVID pandemic, cities are really on the front lines for when extreme weather hits. I'd like to hear from Marina about what the city of Milan is doing to become more resilient, and what are really the quick wins, the sort of low-hanging fruits that you're trying to address, and then what are the more ambitious long-term projects that you have in mind for the city of Milan?
Yeah, from my point of view, and that was sort of closing remark that I am going to anticipate now, is that everything was said by all the people who just talked before, from Belinda to Thomas, is that when you work inside a city and you are a city and municipal administration, you need to integrate all of these points of view. So starting from what we call a multi-benefit approach, we need to, and the COVID taught it to us, we need to improve access to facilities, and space is a facility, is an important facility. Cool spaces are really important for a city that is very dense and that tends to accumulate a lot of heat during the day and tends to release it in a strange way during the night. So people, sometimes citizens, are facing difficulties in leaving the city and in living microclimate in each part of the city. For example, the most poor blocks, or the areas that have minor access to energy efficient buildings, for example, are less lucky than others, and sometimes they do not access green areas, open areas, and cooling areas. So what we need to do is to make all of them access cool places, having them quite easy to reach, and we need also to plan all these places in time. This is very important, something that Belinda told us before. We need to work on different time scale and geographical scale. We need to think about how citizens and how climate is moving in time and around the spaces. Because if I want, for example, to work on greening the city for cooling it down, I also need to plan a lot, to plan the greening at a metropolitan scale, for example, using the Forestami project. So I'm not just planting trees everywhere. I'm thinking on which kind of tree, which species I have to plant. We also have some projects studying which are the trees in which emissions or absorptions are the best and most fit for the city and for the citizens' safety. So which are the trees we have to plant, where we have to plant them, and which kind of green we want to put, because trees are not just the solution, are one part of the solution. We also have to work on albedo, on how the buildings and the entire city reflects the light and tends to accumulate or not the heat. We need to involve citizens, and not just citizens, we need to involve all the kind of stakeholders. Participation is not just letting citizens say what they think about what we do, is involve economic actors, is involve social actors, is involve any kind of different type of citizens, because we do not have just citizens. We also have a lot of people using the city, coming from outside of the city and using it and living in it and bringing emissions to our city, but also bringing richness, bringing development, bringing a lot of culture and diversity. So what I'm trying to say is that we always need to try and consider all the points of view and try and consider multi-benefit solutions. I was making an example before, but I am trying to make another one. For example, tackling heat islands. You can do it creating new cooling spaces, but you are also creating new social spaces. You are also supporting some kind of economic in the area. And you have to keep in mind that you need to offer at least the same level of quality of service, ecological services in this case, to every stakeholder you are addressing. So also in this case, for example, NBS in general are useful for us, because NBS are answering a lot of different kinds of problems. So also I've seen a question before, and I was also listening with a lot of interest about facades. Green facades or green roofs offer multi-benefit resolution to complex problems. And this is just one of the examples. Others could be apps, others could be any other kind of solution that are including social point of view, economic point of view, and environmental point of view. Altogether, then you can speak about resilience, and then you can speak about climate change adaptation. Otherwise, we would only tackle one problem each time, and we will not resolve anything, and we will create more problems just tackling one. So it's quite, it's always a sort of trade-off on what you are doing, what you wish to do, and which is your approach. That must be integrated, must be multi-benefit, and must take care about almost everything I heard from our experts, of course.
Thank you, Marina. Maybe we can go from cities to citizen. I would ask then Belinda, what can citizens do, and how can designers approach the design of climate responsive systems? This morning we heard a lot about vegetation and water-based solutions, but in this session we're trying to focus on climate responsive systems. In your own work, how have you tried to engage the citizen as an active agent, as a participant in the process, and what really can citizens do to help their cities adapt to climate change, help themselves as well?
Yeah, I mean, I would like to start by saying that actually climatic comfort is cultural, and for all of you that probably have been kind of working in different environments, you can really realize that how different it is comfort understood in different parts of the world. And by that, because it is cultural, it can also be kind of shifted or changed or shaped with also kind of different cultures. For instance, just as a little example, I come from the south of Europe, from Madrid, in which we very much live outdoors. Somehow public space is the extension of our domestic space, and life happens outdoors, very intensely. Even in the summer, and even in the summer nights, because we really need this kind of relief space. And again, it's kind of also because we live in apartments, we live these kind of extensions. So we kind of tolerate heat, to a kind of a high degree. And then when I was working for the first time in Miami and traveling to Miami, I really realized, how little tolerance they had to heat, and actually how how their mindsets and their culture is very much around air conditioning, which really kind of shapes their lives, because everything happens indoors. You know, you move from the car to the office to the shopping mall to your house, and everything is in a bubble. And somehow for me that was kind of a very shocking experience, because my work is very much about public space, and public space is about, you know, kind of this shared ground that is accessible to everyone, whereas in other contexts actually life is between private space and public space. You know, the balance is very different, and somehow it's also related to your income. So somehow public space is only for those who cannot afford to have a very comfortable private space. So, you know, maybe that's a little bit extreme, but that's how I felt it. And somehow I think, you know, we've been talking about, you know, priorities. We've been talking about, you know, that I would say that, you know, there is today the resources and the technology that can make us much more aware and much more kind of acknowledged and empowered to make the right decisions. Because of course the information is there. Of course we can track down, you know, every action that we take has an impact in the environment, every single action. And we can track that down and we have that information, but maybe certain people don't have access or don't have the interest to know about their impact. And I think there is, you know, there is an education kind of component that is super important, because people do need to have that information to make the appropriate actions or decisions. And so I am a designer. I am trained as an architect and urban designer, but I've been kind of incorporating in our agenda in the office this kind of participatory approach, because we cannot design people's space. We have taken them into consideration. It doesn't make any sense. So we've been working in different parts of the world, and of course we don't have a recipe that works for all. We've been testing and trying different things, because of course also the projects are of different scales. So we've engaged people in different ways. But I would say, I would like to emphasize something, that we do need to do this participation as the officer was mentioning before. We really need to work not only with the citizens, but also with different stakeholders. We created workshops with officials, with developers, with the creative people, with entrepreneurs, but also with the younger generations, because, you know, they're kind of the caretakers of the city in 10 more years, in 20 more years. So we've been doing a lot of work with not only teenagers, but also with the kids in the different places, trying to define or to design the appropriate tools that engage them into this conversation. So of course, we do design this kind of participation kits that are addressing specific topics and specific issues, but also trying to speak the language that they speak. So we really assume that if we do an amazing workshop, teenagers are not going to show up. And so how can we speak their language? How can we do something more technological that they find that is, worth their time? So I would like to emphasize, it's not that we designers have to do everything, but I think citizens do have the capacity and the will and to learn more and to know more and to be more engaged. But there is a component of education. And we had the opportunity to work in France a few years ago, and they have a very clear approach to participation. They said, if you want to come to this workshop, which is about participating, you have to come to the previous workshop, which is about getting information. So it's not only about having an opinion, it's about being informed about why some decisions are the most appropriate than others, and why some materials on some programs or whatever make more sense, are they're more kind of resilient in the long term. So I do, I agree with, of course, with many of the things that have been said. We do have the technology, we do have the capacity, we can measure, we can come to some conclusions, but I think there's still a kind of a gap between us or the scientists who do have the information and some of the people. And I am completely aware about what Professor Santamoris was mentioning about, it's a matter of priorities. Of course, if you are struggling to kind of just to survive, let's say, it's very difficult to pay attention to to the climate change. But I think it's part of the solution. So I really think that there is a need to kind of engage public or engage people in many different ways, and we have to make an effort in this direction. I will leave it here and I'll see.
Thank you, Belinda. I love the idea to involve children. I'm a young mother, and the next workshop that I will be involved in and panel I'll be moderating is with a group of 1-year-olds, because we'll be design tools for newborns in the city of Venice. So I love that idea, and I might reach out to you for some tips on how to involve children in the design process. Professor Steemers, I see you have your hand raised. Would you like to weigh in?
Yes, thank you. Thanks very much. I think Belinda raised the point about the outdoor space being an extension of the indoor space. And we can think of this as a continuum rather than think of it as either outdoors or indoors, and create a much richer set of conditions for the activities that, that were discussed in terms of social and economic activities. And I think this is as true, perhaps even more so, in the third world and in developing countries, and even in slums. These outdoor intermediate environments are crucial for social, political engagement and economic activities. And when you move people out of horizontal slums into vertical slums, government designed vertical slums, there's a massive failure that happens at that point, because there's no sort of political or social capital, let's say. And often we miss the voices of women in those contexts, who are, have significant expertise and knowledge about how they live and cook and work with their kids, etc. So we need to listen. But in a sense, if you want to find out about the quality of the urban environment, you ask the people. You don't measure it, you don't model it, you ask the people. You say to them, how do you use this space? What is successful about it? What do you think you need? What kind of options and opportunities do you prefer? And we found that as you, in the UK, we compared two housing districts, one with a lot of private gardens and not much outdoor public space, mostly roads, and a big park to play football in, with another urban housing estate where there was a shift of emphasis. You reduce the amount of private gardens and you invest that into public spaces, both hard landscape for football and cycling, but also soft landscape for meeting different people and a diversity of spaces. And then you ask people about, or you measure their well-being, you measure their social capital, and you can identify clear advantages in a more diverse and rich urban environment where there's an investment in outdoor space. And this, I think this is true whether you're in the developed world or in the developing world. So that's the key thing I wanted to say at this point.
Thomas, do you want to weigh in as well?
Yeah, just quickly. Let's say more and more in building design, I think just what Professor Stevens just mentioned, we talk about mid-door space, and it's funny, this kind of this term, how you see how language can have an impact. This term is kind of intriguing people and making them very creative to think about things. Does not necessarily need to be indoor or outdoor, it can be somewhere in between. At the same time, let's say, coming back to the roof structures in Andalusia, etc., we know that we get issues with pollution if we do not have sufficient air exchange in our cities, etc., etc. So there are two problems with traffic, which is the one is pollution, which we might get rid of having electric cars, but the other one is space, the space of a car. And we did studies for Master City at the time, let's say 10-ish years ago, where we showed that we can only create a kind of climate control environment in a new city. We can also do this for transformational strategies without having the wide streets. The wide streets, the car infrastructure, the absorbing of solar energy on the street, all these things that come along with car infrastructure is a problem. So we have to get, I think we have to get into this discussion about, or in this kind of negotiation of space between car infrastructure and other uses for climate adaptation, public realm for people, etc., and other means like walking, biking, etc. But we have to actively start this negotiation of space. The car absorbs too much space in our cities. And then let me finish with one thing. I'm always a little concerned about the language we use. First of all, I hate the word climate catastrophe. It's not a catastrophe by definition. Is something that happens all of a sudden. This is something we know, Professor Santamura has already mentioned, we know for the last 50 years, and it's going to be with us for the next 50 years. So it's just climate change. It's nothing else. And I think we are scientists, we have to deal with it, and we have to think about how we can build up on it to create better cities, better environments, a better world. I think that's the potential we have. And we should be careful about this kind of dramatic wording because we lose people. If we do this all the time, I think we have to be a little careful of how we describe the things that are happening. Thanks.
If we have time, I would like to come back to the question of semantics and the vocabulary use, as well as the kind of competition for the public realm. What do we use it for? Car infrastructure is one option, green infrastructure. I'd like to come back also to Marina from the city of Milan to understand what the citizens of Milan have chosen to prioritize, what is the public backlash when decisions are made. But first, let's go to Professor Santamoris. I see you have a hand raised. You'd like to weigh in as well. Please.
Thank you very much. And thank you all the colleagues for the excellent comments and the wonderful discussion. 2 points which are very important. First, I think that, researchers and scientists, they should not be optimistic or, let's say, pessimistic. They have to be realistic. This is the most important, and we try to be realistic. And to be realistic, we have to know really what really happens around us. Second point that I like really to stress is that there is a very strong link between global climatic change and regional climatic change. Although we may, let's say, design our cities using the best technology, using the best knowledge, we may have an impact, because of the global climatic change, because of the political, let's say, conditions. For example, to be very specific, the increase of the temperature of the water in the Indian and the Pacific Ocean increases the evaporation of the water and increases the Rossby waves, from the tropics to the South Pole and the Northern Pole. Because, this air is passing above, the desert, it increases tremendously the, let's say, frequency and the magnitude of heat waves in, the Australian cities, most of the Australian cities, which are in the coastal area. Although we may apply the best possible, let's say, technology, the best knowledge in order to improve our cities, unfortunately, this increases the temperature, increases the frequency, increases the magnitude of the heat waves. So what really happens in the third world, especially in Asia, it affects the Australian cities. It affects the other cities as well. So it is very important to understand that we are living in a global world, and this global world affects one the other. So we cannot really forget what is happening around us and live in our micro world. If we do that, we will lose the trade. Take into account what has happened in China about air conditioning, the last 20 years. 20 years ago in China, the penetration of air conditioning in the urban area was 2%. You know how much is this now? 96%. 20 years ago in the rural area, of China, the penetration of air conditioning was very close to zero. Now is 85%. So there are global, let's say, developments which really play a tremendous role. As I mentioned yesterday, Mumbai, in the next 20 years, will have higher energy consumption for cooling than the whole United States. These are developments that affects tremendously, not only India or China, but affects tremendously the whole world. So when we discuss about regional climatic change, environmental quality of our cities, or whatever it has to do with, let's say, our cities, we have to always take in mind and, let's say, keep in mind that, we are very much influenced by the others. On the other hand, we should not be pessimistic. We have to fight. We have to fight. We have to improve our environment. For example, here in Sydney, we really succeeded to ban dark roofs all around the country and all around the city. And this was really a major fight. And we convinced the politicians, yes, we have to fight to improve our, let's say, cities. We have the knowledge, we have really the technology, but we don't have to forget really the impact of policy, of regional, local policy, and the global developments. Thank you.
I'd like to, for a moment, scale down from tackling the problems at the world scale and bring it back down to the user, some of the things that we were talking about with Belinda and with Professor Steemers. I'd also like to involve Marika and Sinead, who have been patiently waiting for their opportunity to share their points with us. Sinead and America have been working with our team at CRA on a number of design projects, and we usually start from the user when we start a design process. And I would like to hear from the two of you of how the design of outdoor spaces can take into consideration a user's thermal comfort, both from the physiological standpoint, but also from the psychological standpoint. And maybe I'll also ask Professor Steemers to weigh in on this same topic. Marika, did you want to start?
Yeah, thanks. Well, from the design point of view, at the urban scale, or at least the master planning scale, which is the one I'm focusing on right now, I'd say I like to explore the user perspective and its relationship with thermal comfort, because I think it's a valuable layer in the design process. I mean, including the climate perspective, it makes the designer also think about how the user is experiencing the space that he's proposing. He can adjust the design, and this is also something that I'm working on with CRA. This is part of the research that I'm really enjoying. For instance, one proposal that I'm working on is to include the different level of ability of the user to experience the space and to point out different users. And this is just one side, but we can take into account also physiological aspects. There's a lot of research also by professors, psychological adaptation. And I think that we're always talking about people, we're always talking about user, but really pointing out clearly the user we're designing for and the fact that users may have different needs and may experience the space in different ways, so provide diversity in the sense of more opportunity to adapt different climate conditions, microclimate conditions in the same space. This is a really practical strategy to implement in the design practice, in my opinion.
Thank you. Yeah, I think actually everyone's on the same page. Like it's been said, I think thermal comfort, what's interesting about thermal comfort is it considers the individual characteristics of the person and how they experience the space. And it also considers that people have the ability to adapt. So we don't want to over design. We don't want to just fix a certain temperature as the goal that a place has to reach, because it changes. So, I mean, I think this has been like kind of brought up by not just this afternoon, but also previously Gerald Mills was saying we need to provide thermal diversity across the space. And you can kind of give that on different scales, like with just a single device. What I mentioned in my presentation was one of the projects from CRA, Sun and Shade, which people can kind of override the automated sun tracking mechanism and play with it themselves to determine how much sunlight is reflected away from them and how much they want towards them. Or even just a simple canopy that it's easy to kind of take around and move to where you want. So I don't know, I think that in terms of thermal comfort and psychology, in terms of thermal comfort and physiology, there's like this scientific side of reaching a cooling effect, but then there's the psychological side of like having this interaction and this choice. And actually, I'd be interested if anyone has some examples of their own projects or projects they know of where there's the ability to interact with the thing that's providing the thermal comfort.
Does anyone want to take that question, or Professor Steemers, do you want to weigh in on the different aspects of thermal comfort?
Yeah, I think these sound like really interesting projects. I wasn't able, unfortunately, to hear Sinead's presentation, so I don't quite know what kind of devices she's talking about, apart from that beautiful image on the CRA website. But I guess I have a slight concern about using technology to answer the problem, because in a way like I said at the beginning, we are climate adaptive as human beings. We move around the space. We behave differently at night. We behave differently in the winter and the summer. And so we're incredibly well versed and skilled at responding, as long as the conditions are not outside certain extremes. So if there's no extreme problem, so if you're not in, let's say, an incredibly hot desert with no shade, then I think we're able to find spaces and places that we enjoy and that thrive. And obviously we can think of ways of designing more spaces like that and better spaces like that that allow that to happen. But when you start talking about devices, it depends what kind of device you're talking about. When you start talking about devices, it makes me think of, well, a bit of like Thomas's example of the electric car. You know, it's a solution to one problem, but it's actually got unintended consequences on a whole bunch of other issues that may be much more critical. And there's a sense that maybe these devices make us lazier and make us less creative and exploratory in terms of how we understand and live in a city and interact with people. So I think I think it's a really interesting idea, and I think there's a role for these devices to play, particularly when things get more extreme and more dramatic. But beware of the unintended consequences of such systems.
But I mean, I agree, and yeah, I think that also some people don't have the ability to adapt so much, like maybe physically and maybe culturally. Like I read a paper recently that was saying that in the space they studied, only the men were able to take advantage of the shade, because they didn't, socially it wasn't acceptable for the men and women to share the space together. So I'm kind of interested in how design can help with this kind of accessibility issue as well.
I think you make a really good point, actually, and I think that sounds like a fantastic focus for the work, is to identify those situations. I think that's a really, really interesting proposition.
I'd like to ask a question that was posed by one of our audience members yesterday, but we didn't get a chance to address it in yesterday's session. And it's about existing contexts, older cities, more passive and traditional means of doing climate adaptation versus a sort of tabula rasa context, a new build, a contemporary city, a city to be built from scratch. I'd like to call on Thomas to kick off the discussion, because we've had the pleasure of working with your team both in sort of untouched sand dunes of the Middle East, as well as bustling boulevards of European capitals. So together we've really seen kind of both contexts. And I'm curious to know how your approach to climate responsive system differs in a tabula rasa, a blank slate situation, versus an existing medieval city. You mentioned Andalusia previously. How do you approach the two scenarios?
Just one, Daniele Belleri already raised a hand. Maybe, I'm not sure. She.
Daniele Belleri is the Where's Waldo of our group. Maybe you can rename yourself on Zoom, Marina.
Marina.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I was just trying to ask to intervene, since I'm really sorry I need to go. I had a meeting already previously fixed at 3 p.m. So, of course, I have to thank you all for this invitation and for this very intensive debate, because a lot of issues rose up, and I think that I will bring all of them inside the debate of the municipality offices. So, of course, if you have more questions or comments, they are more than welcome. You have, as an organization, all my contacts and Piero's contacts. Yeah, and now I see that I'm named as Daniele Belleri. I'm sorry. But anyway, sorry, I really have
so much, Marina. We will collect any additional questions for your team and share them with you via email. Thanks again.
Thank you very much again, and have a nice
Take care. See you in Milan.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Bye. Yeah, coming back to your question, Emma. I think, first of all, I think we never worked on a master plan for a climate adaptation strategy for an entire existing city. So when we do urban design in current environments, it's a new district somewhere, or let's say a block in a city or something like this. So it's more smaller interventions. Whereas sometimes, like the master plan we worked on together, were like rather new developments in Saudi Arabia or wherever. And that's a very different story. Interestingly enough, we always come to the conclusion that in terms of shading and sun protection, sun exposure in new developments, we need to solve transportation. I come back to this issue again. We have to solve transportation in a different way. But let's say the methodology, the tools we use, the way we approach it, I think is always the same. In a given context, you have more constraints because there is many more things are given. And I think it requires maybe more creativity from all of us, from science as well as from designers, to deal with, let's say, the high quality of our cities. I think we don't want to lose them. We don't want to wake up at one morning and think, oh my God, what happened? So that's why I think it's more about being aware of the qualities we have and try to make them even better. Instead of doing tabula rasa. I think tabula rasa is not a solution, is a no-brainer, and nothing we can even think of. I think we have so many possibilities within the current context that there is no need for tabula rasa. And the question, let's say, we raised together, or we worked on together with these new kind of city developments, we also worked on Neom City, are more like in context of what Professor Santamori said. Of course, those are very different environment, very different context. Also in other places in, let's say, the global South, where we see very different issues. However, I'm always concerned if we really understand the social implications in these places. I always think whether it's really appropriate that we do work in these places. I'm always ambivalent about doing work in those places without having any locals involved. I'm not sure if or let's put it this way, I'm very sure that we do not understand all the social fabrics and relationships and constraints of the things we design. So that's why I'm concerned.
Thank you. We're nearing the end of the session, and I wanted to wrap up with one final question, which I asked Professor Santamores yesterday, and I liked so much his answer that I would like to hear from anyone, from all of you, hopefully, what you think about the topic. For young professionals such as ourselves, or more seasoned experts who are looking to reskill and to insert themselves in the space of climate responsive design and climate adaptation in cities. How do we get involved? Where are the gaps in the research? Where do we need to dive deeper? What type of skills or knowledge bases are we missing? How can we fill in the gaps in the years to come? Belinda, would you like to start?
Yeah, but you said that I didn't listen to Professor Santamori's response yesterday, and it was so good that I don't know if I dare. Okay, no, I would like to emphasize that we all have a kind of a very important role in this kind of issue, and from the microscopic composition of one material that is kind of performing in a building to all the landscape or territorial design. So I think it's just a matter of an attitude or an interest, and there's not a particular scale for maybe I'm not right, but I don't think there is a particular scale in which this is super important. I think it's all across the scales. And again, for those people designing a building, for those people designing public space and neighborhood planning or territorial decisions, because it's kind of affecting, the climate change is kind of informed by all these decisions. So I think there is, today we have the opportunity to navigate, Google and surf, and there's so much information. I think actually there's too much of information, or it's a little bit overwhelming to navigate, but it kind of, it's very time consuming. But also I think it's about identifying the good sources of information to kind of stay up to date, and to, we need this proactivity from professionals. We need this proactivity from officials and decision makers and policy makers. As it's been mentioned before, it's not only a matter of technology, or it's not only a matter of knowledge, it's a lot about policy. And we also need, again, the general public and the users and the citizens to be more aware and more proactive, because the minute that they become more proactive and more demanding in terms of solutions, politicians want to win elections, and they will kind of, get onto it. So I think this, and also the industry, let us not forget that these people are kind of providing the materials, providing the building systems. So they're making the solutions. So, the minute that there is a policy that is requesting them to do it in a particular way, they have to do it. So I think, again, I like to think that it's a kind of a broad question for everybody to be involved. There is the opportunity. And of course, what would be the first action? Like, you would sign up for every seminar or webinar that is kind of talking about this topic, if you're really kind of interested. And even if I only attended today's session, I must say that, you always take something away with you. And it's been a very inspiring session. And I thank you all for that. So thank you so much for the invitation. Mm-hmm.
So step one, done.
Exactly.
Join a seminar. Professor Steemers, what advice can you offer to young professionals or seasoned professionals looking to upskill and join the fight?
Very little, to be honest. I mean, I think when people like Matt and I started talking about sustainability, what, 30 or 40 years ago, Matt? I don't guess how long ago, and probably less for Thomas. There wasn't much space for it. There weren't many voices listening. Now it's everywhere, and there's a huge momentum, and there are people like you guys doing stuff from a technical point of view, from an anthropological point of view, from an urban modeling point of view, and I think that's extremely satisfying, to see this all happening now and having an effect compared to 30 years ago when we were sort of talking to nobody. But so I think you're doing the right things. I think Soloclim is a good example of that, and the interdisciplinarity of the teams and the students. There will be roles for everyone to deal with these pressing problems of the day.
Thomas?
Yeah, not much more to add. I think keep going would be the most important recommendation. Let's say overall, I think I'm very sure if we look back in history in architecture development, whatever had been considered in architecture as the future and as an utopia, we kind of smile on it when we look at it now. Let's say the car city, for instance, etc., etc. I think there's so many examples. The Charter of Athens, a big one. So I'm pretty sure that the young researchers are going to smile on us as well in 20 years from now. In the context we do not understand yet, probably, but I think this is going to happen for sure. What is most important as a community and for the young people in particular, I think we have to lead by example. We need good examples. And Melinda, coming back, I think your work in Madrid, this boulevard was very influential for Transholder, for our work. And we always showed it and said, like, these are things we can do on a small scale to create a spot where people can gather. And just recently, I was involved in a discussion in my hometown, Stuttgart. And there was someone, a woman who is, let's say, going to soccer clubs and talk to the kids and do hikes with them and show them climate adaptation strategies and what they can do. And I was so impressed, and I thought, we are just talking. This lady is doing it, what we should do. And I think this is what we should do more, as it said, leading by example, having good examples, and and they don't need to be big in scale. They can be very small scale. I think it's not a matter of scale. We have to be successful, like Belinda said it, we have to be successful on every scale. And so it can be very small intervention and then show it and talk about it. I think that's something we all need to do.
Thank you.
And we all can do. I think that's important.
Thank you, Thomas. We're all out of time, but I will leave time for Professor Santamoris if you have any closing remarks, very short closing remarks, if you have anything to say, or inspirational words for the next generation, please, the stage is yours.
Very short. So, my advice to my students is that this is a huge challenge. This is something new. This is something that we have invented the very last years. We knew about climatic change, but what is happening now is something that we never had the experience. So in order to face the problem, given that our experience is not enough, they have to improve their knowledge. They have to study, improve their knowledge, improve their scientific background, stop thinking in an empirical way, stop living with myths, live with science, perhaps with technology. You cannot forget technology. And they have to be inventive because they will face, especially those living in the third world, very, let's say, new and not known conditions that really needs to be addressed with, let's say, a lot of knowledge and a lot of real science.
Thank you very much. Great. So that concludes our final session. We heard from research, we heard from private practice, we heard from public administration, we heard from the world down to the nano or quantum material. So I think we certainly haven't exhausted the topic, but we've covered a full range of perspectives.